So I needed to talk a little bit about the road to revolution, how we got from the euphoria of ousting the Catholics from North America in the French and Indian War, the disturbance that happened with the proclamation of 1763, in which the colonists were forbidden by the king to move farther west than the crest of the Appalachian Mountains. Questions that you have to think about are, how was the British government going to balance their budget, and what was the reaction for the American colonists to those taxes? The purpose of the Stamp Act, and did it really do any good? What were the other events that caused the British and the British at home and the colonists to be further divided? And how did they end up with open warfare? Because there's always the question, when did the revolution occur? Was it the actual battles? Was it the war? Or was the revolution occurring over the entire first half or first 3/4 of the 18th century? So was the revolution in the minds of the people who were living here, or was it the actual battles? And because they already had declared independence, my husband's from Ecuador, and he questions, he's like, why did they declare independence and then have the fight? And that he thinks that makes no sense. They should have had the fight and then declared independence, in his view. But actually, they were declaring independence, and had Britain allowed them to leave, the colonists wouldn't have had the fight. They wouldn't have had the battles. They wouldn't have had the war. So they declared their independence, and then they had to fight because the British were going to keep control if they possibly could. So why did the American colonies choose independence in 1776? So it goes back to money, of course, with the cost of the French and Indian War. The British saw that as they were paying the cost for some upstarts in the colonies, George Washington notably, and this war cost them a great deal. Their national debt was doubled by the time this war is over. And so you have to also consider that conflict was not necessarily inevitable. The colonists, if you go back and read the documents, the letters they were sending to King George, you see that they were very humble. They didn't necessarily want to go to war. They didn't necessarily want independence. But the farther they got into it and the less the king listened to them, things got, they were ratcheted up somewhat. So you had these writs of assistance, and what they did was, these were general search warrants, and they were tired of, the Brits were tired of the colonists smuggling to the Caribbean and usurping their mercantilist ideals. And there are slides that I have somewhere, but I need to explain mercantilism. Mercantilism is an economic system, basically, in which the colonies were meant to be subordinate, and the colonies are in existence for the benefit of the mother country, not vice versa. They're not there to benefit themselves. Colonies are there to benefit the mother country. So what in a mercantilist society, what happens is, like, the colonies would send their raw goods, lumber, beaver pelts, deer skin, shipbuilding equipment, those kinds of things, to the colonies, sugar to the mother country. Then the mother country the people there would either manufacture or just slap new taxes on it, tariffs on these goods, and then distribute them to the countries in Europe. Meanwhile, so what was happening is, the goods were going to England. The English were putting a tax on it, a tariff, and then selling it for higher prices so that they got their cut off of the colonial goods. Then the colonists were forced to ship enumerated goods, meaning not all goods, but most goods had to go to England. They had to go on British ships, which kept British ships built busy. Their crews, their captains, so they have better employment because they're using all British people. They're keeping all of the money within their one government, within their one country. Because of that, the colonies are totally benefiting the mother country. Then they have to buy certain goods they ship the manufactured goods from England back to the colonies. The colonies then buy the goods that they already shipped the raw goods for. So it's a completely self-sufficient situation. Okay, so the idea is that the British were keeping all their money at home, and in this is not the economic system, of course, that we espouse today, but the idea was that the colonists believed this was a very limiting system. They knew that they could be making more money if they didn't have to send their goods to, excuse me, they didn't have to send their goods back to England. They could sell them to the people in the Caribbean, and they could sell to other all the different countries. They could do their own shipping, and so they thought they could get more money, and they wouldn't have to pay to give the taxes to the British government. So this mercantilist system was a point of contention from. It started with the Navigation Acts of 1651, and then you had Navigation Acts throughout the late 17th century into the 18th century, and these Navigation Acts, like molasses from the Caribbean, had to be shipped on British ships. So they had these enumerated goods, and so it got increasingly restrictive over the next 90 years or so, from the 1650s on into the mid-18th century. So this was a problem. So what they were doing was they had these writs of assistance. And what this meant was that it was to stop smuggling. People could come, customs officials could come on to any ships that were in any port in the colonies. They could search for whatever. Anything they wanted to look for, they could look for. And so you have James Otis. This is an image of James Otis in 1761. He writes about how terrible this is, that they have free reign. And in Boston later on, basically John Hancock was a smuggler. And John Hancock was a shipper as well. He was in shipping. And so customs officials come onto one of his ships and they start searching. And in fact, he is a smuggler. But he obviously doesn't want anybody to know that. But so this was a big deal for him as well. So John Hancock was probably the most famous smuggler of the colonies. So political ownership and political participation and property ownership was easy enough in the colonies if you were a man, of course, and if you were white. Americans were used to running their own affairs on a daily basis. And so the king's authority was weaker and weaker. These people were not from England. These people were colonial-born citizens by this point. None of these people, vast majority, had never been to England. They believed the king was their king, but it was not like they knew what he looked like. And actually no king from Europe ever showed up in the colonies. It was too dangerous to make that trip, and so no king from England ever came to the colonies. So in 1763, when Britain tries to start taxing, these people are shocked to death, and they buck against the system. It's sort of like teenagers or whatever. They don't want to be told what to do. This is an image from Williamsburg, Virginia, in which the Colonial at the Capitol building, and so you can go there and visit now. It's actually very beautiful. It's been well restored, so you can see what things were like, what life was like in Williamsburg, the capital of Virginia in the 18th century. So the British at home, they see a strained budget. They're poor and pitiful, supposedly. They're trying to reduce their expenses. They want to increase their revenue. They have French competitors, and India is Britain ends up controlling India. India becomes one of the British colonies after the French and Indian War as a result of the treaty that was made. So India is, everybody's been wanting spices and silks and those kinds of things from India for decades and decades. That was the reason that the original explorers wanted to go to the Orient. Your American perspective is that they wanted to go west, and the king had put his foot down with the proclamation of 1763. The difference is the king could not enforce the proclamation line of 1763 because he was 3,000 miles away. So American expansion continues. People continue to go west of the Appalachian Mountains, and they risk their lives with Indian attacks and stuff, but they go anyway. The victory over the Indians for the Americans was more important than the victory over the French. The Indians were a much more important opponent for them because they caused them more problems on a daily basis. The French were not that big a deal. The French were the opponents of Britain at home, but not here in the colonies so much. They were disturbed about the Indians and the fact that they couldn't go west. And then you had the proclamation line of 1763. So the stamp tax, after the French and Indian War, Britain has 140 million pounds worth of debt. Half of that was from the war itself. They only had 70 million pounds of debt when they started. They wanted to the British officials wanted to redefine this relationship with the colonies. They wanted to assert their control more. And after 150 years of independence, basically, for all practical purposes, the colonists did not like this plan. So the idea is that George Grenville, who was the prime minister in 1763, says the Navy is going to strictly enforce these navigation laws, the ones that I referred to earlier from 1651, 1690s, that they're going to be on the high seas and they're going to be looking for people who are smuggling and who are using other shippers besides Royal English shippers. 1764, they enact the Sugar Act, which was the first law that was ever passed solely to raise tax revenue from the colonies. They did lower the duties after this, and the protests stopped. So what this was you had the British government, they'd enact a tax, and then if there was a big enough protest, they would go back and ease those restrictions some. They did this over and over and over, and it was one more antagonism after another. These colonial symbols, you had the Liberty Tree, where they would hang the British officials in effigy. Liberty Tree, the first one was in Boston. You had the regulators, they were South Carolina people, and they in the back country, that means 50 miles off the coast, so they were kind of in the backwoods, so to speak. And they were protesting about the fact that they were underrepresented in the Colonial Assembly in South Carolina. They wanted these regulators were disturbed. So you have these smaller level protests going on in the 1760s where people are, the idea of a protest is not unheard of. So you get this sense that the colonists are going to, rebellion becomes more and more normalized. Yeah, the Sons of Liberty, this is Sam Adams. Sons of Liberty was a radical group of opponents of all of these laws. Sam Adams was not involved in the combat in the war. He was the mastermind of the strategy for how to convince people that independence was the way to go. He was very radical. We also had these committees of correspondence. And what these people would do is they would write letters to all their friends in different colonies. They would write to family members. And then they would pass all these letters around, trying to, more sort of like the network the not virtual network is like a Facebook, but not online, of course. So you had all these different connections between people, and so they would write letters and of trying to convince people of what needed to happen, and so they call them committees of correspondence. Correspondence meaning they were writing letters. So the Sugar Act of 1764 revamped this Sugar and Molasses Act of 1733. This tax, they had 6 pence, basically 6 pennies a gallon on tax on imported molasses. Well, it was cheaper to smuggle it from the French West Indies, so rather than pay that 6 pence tax. And you know, molasses is what you make rum from, so that's what the value was there. They also had smuggling. They smuggled wine, coffee, pimientos, calico fabric, and then they lumber and iron. The Currency Act of 1764. So they had a shortage. There were no silver mines and gold mines, and so they ended up having to print their own money in the colonies. Well, you can't print unregulated. You can't have unregulated printing of money. It ruins the economy, and the inflation goes sky high. So there was always a shortage of currency in the colonies. There was never enough money. So there was a lot of bartering going on. They were always cash poor. When they bought goods from England, they would use the credits. For example, George Washington would send wheat and flax and all the different, most farmers were tobacco farmers in Virginia. Well, they would send their goods to England, and in return, they would get credit with companies there. So once George sent all of his tobacco and his flax and all the different goods that he was sending from the colonies, Martha could then, and he could too, of course, but they could order goods to be shipped back. No money changed hands, so it was a credit situation. So they would send the goods, and then they would order the goods that they needed here in the colonies to be sent back, but they were always cash poor. So 1764, with this Currency Act, the Parliament says no more paper money because the economy was too volatile. So this is a huge problem because now they have even less currency. You have to also remember, in colonial America, because there was no English money to be had much, they would use Spanish doubloons, Spanish money, Spanish coins. They used Italian money. They used any kind of money that they could get their hands on as a currency. And so Spanish money coins were, because of their gold and silver mines in Central and South America, Spanish money was better, was the most globalized currency around. Everybody traded in Spanish coins, so that's a pretty good deal too. So we're going to stop there and give you a break, and then we'll talk some more in a minute.